Okay. Well, you know what? While he's doing that, I'm gonna get started, okay? Because either he will come in after my preamble, or I will finish the preamble and he won't be here, and I'll know that I have to just plow through this. Like I said, okay, that would be fine. All right, so we're going to be talking about Jorge Luis Borges. If you don't know Borges, he's kind of a, I guess now a sort of famous or infamous Argentinian author. He's mostly known for, I guess, the reigning metaphor in a lot of his works being a labyrinth. And we, Daniel and I thought it was kind of like a fun, tongue in cheek, almost really kind of perverse thing to talk about Borges in the context of escape and escapism. Um, because the whole nature of the labyrinth is to keep you trapped. You can't get out. Now, the way that Borges thought about the labyrinth, or the way that he appeared to think about the labyrinth, is sort of like all of literature in some way, shape, or form is a labyrinth. Now, I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that he started reading a lot of really heavy stuff really young. His father's mother was English, so he grew up speaking English in the home, and his father was a lawyer who had this like huge library. So Borges was reading all of this stuff at a really young age. In fact, Borges translated Oscar Wilde's Happy Prince from English into Spanish at the age of 10, and they had to put his father's name on it in order to get it published, because nobody would believe that a 10-year-old had published this. So the reading metaphor in a lot of his work is the labyrinth, or a lot of his work from a particular period, sort of like the things that he's known for. And the other thing that he's really known for is sort of like these heady metaphysical games, these heady sort of meta literary or metatextual games. And Daniel's back, and that's a very good thing. But that's sort of what he's known for, and that's why he's kind of famous in this kind of like high theory sort of way. So what we thought was we would take a look at some of the ways that he tries to escape the labyrinth, right? It doesn't quite work. You can never quite get out of the framework of all of the past literature. And again, to go back to the metaphor of the labyrinth, that's what he's sort of all about. Whatever you're writing, if you read it early enough, whatever you're writing, you begin to be able to anticipate how everything else is going to function. So everything becomes a variation or permutation of everything that's already been written before. So what else is there to do? You're just wandering down more and new and different sort of cul-de-sacs in this giant grid. Okay, so that doesn't account for all of Borges' works. In fact, that really sort of accounts for a particular piece of his work. His work was really a lot more varied, especially if you go to the poetry or the literary essays. You know, he was writing poems sort of in different Latin American genres that have a lot more to do with the place and history of Argentina. He wrote literary essays about nearly anything and everything. He even wrote film reviews. He wrote an essay on King Kong, the original King Kong. So he's really more varied than just the mirrors and labyrinths. But we thought, for fun, let's take a look at the labyrinths and let's think about escape. All right. So the 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 way that I think to approach this is to think about his. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes. The way I think to approach this is to think about how his history or how his literary reputation progressed. He really sort of thought of himself as kind of a local writer. He was a big fish in a small pond, the small pond being Buenos Aires. And he was well known in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, but in the early part of the 20th century, despite some really phenomenal work being done, phenomenal literature being written in the Spanish language, it was viewed as kind of like a secondary literary language. You want your English, you want your French, you want a little bit of your German, but Spanish, it's sort of like, what do you got? Well, I mean, come on, the whole surrealist stuff was happening in Spain at the time, and there was a lot more going on. But the way it was viewed in the early to mid part of the 20th century is secondary language. Now, when Borges begins to get translated and hit the scene, his writing, in particular, the ways that he's thinking about literary reality versus real reality, what is fiction, what is not fiction, all of these sort of like variations and permutations, they sort of correspond with the rise of theory, high theory, and in particular deconstruction. Now, I'm not going to get into deconstruction except to sort of glance at it a little bit. I don't want to spend this whole time talking about that because I'm not even quite sure that I would have a whole lot to say. But the thing is, there can be a point of contact between a lot of Spanish language literature and deconstruction because, as the theorist and critic who I believe we've talked about before, Echeverria, points out in Celestina's Brood, if you go back to Golden Age Spanish writing, there is a real interest in bringing together sort of binary poles and looking at the way that the poles, the more you put an emphasis on them, sort of dismantle each other, and these sort of like hard parameters you put around concepts or ideas or people or positions or what have you, they sort of melt the more you take a focus at them, and you get these weird hybrids back and forth, what Echeverria sort of labels monsters. So Echeverria takes this and sort of locates the beginning of this concern in this weird work called Celestina, which is not quite a novel. It's not quite a play. It's this weird kind of in-between thing. And he traces how these concerns with dismantling binaries and things like that, or presenting these stark binaries that fall to pieces, eventually end up as a huge component of Latin American literature. All right, so Borges, whether or not he's self-consciously playing in this vein, does sort of replicate some of this stuff. So his literary reputation really sort of corresponds with this interest in deconstruction, particularly the deconstructive interest in the way that binaries, when you put a certain kind of pressure on them, dismantle each other and sort of bleed into each other. Okay, so that gets us back to the Labyrinth, and the Labyrinth is a trap, right? The Labyrinth, as Borges conceives it, is often composed of these kinds of dualities, right? And you can have one end mirroring the other end, and at the end of the day, the dualities sort of break down each other. But the thing is, in deconstruction, when you put pressure on the binaries or when you put pressure on them intellectually to show that the ways that the binaries dismantle each other, what you are supposed to end with is some sort of, I guess, liberatory moment, right? In Borges, you don't end in liberation, you end in yet another trap. There's no real way out of these things. And so this dismantled binary or this hybridity or this monstrosity is usually just another variation or permutation signaling that there are more variations and permutations like later down the road. All right, so that's my preamble. And the three sort of things, the three sort of trends or ideas that we're sort of looking at here, there are three ways that I was thinking that we could take this on perversely. Three ways that Borges maybe sort of kind of tries to get out of the labyrinth, tries to escape. And we're looking at different versions of escape. So the first version that I thought we could look at is escapism. And in particular, the escapism offered by genre fiction, right? So Borges uses detective stories a lot. He uses that genre a lot to do certain kinds of things, right? And we were looking at two detective stories in particular, the first being Death in the Compass, and the second being The Approach to Al-Mutazim. So, Daniel, could you do me a favor and quickly summarize Death in the Compass and Approach to Al-Mutazim?
Absolutely. And I apologize in advance for all of the network chicanery. Am I coming through? Can you hear me? All right. Fantastic. And hello, everybody. So I
Perfect.
thank you, Claude, for having me summarize these incredibly slippery and meta textual stories. But I think we'll start with Death in the Compass. It's I guess, it's kind of as close as we might get to a run-of-the-mill detective story. But Lonrot is a famous detective. He is assigned to a case where a famous rabbi who's in town for a Talmudic convention was found murdered, stabbed to death. And he is convinced that he actually has all the, this scholar's material sort of parceled up and sent to his office for him to go through, because he's convinced that it's this writer's interest in Jewish esotericism is somehow connected to his murder. There is, and at the scene of the crime, there is typed onto the rabbi's typewriter the cryptic sentence, "The first letter of the name has been uttered." And so our detective Lonrot immediately connects that with the Tetragrammaton, the unspeakable four-letter name of God, the possible in the Hasidic tradition, the unutterable 100th name of God. So a month later, there is a second murder that takes place in front of I guess like a paint store that has these kind of this rhomboid patterns, right? These kind of harlequin diamonds. And another sentence is left. The second letter of the name has been uttered. And the same thing happens the next month. And these three murder sites create an equilateral triangle if you plot them out on the city map. So Lonrot, our detective, is not convinced. It said, no, this is the last letter of the name has been uttered with this third message. He's not convinced. The Tetragrammaton is 4 letters. We've already established a rhombus or a diamond is involved. So he plots it out. If you're going to take this equilateral triangle and make a rhombus out of it, where is the fourth point going to be? And there meets his criminal antithesis, his great rival Charlash. And it turns out that none of this had anything to do with the Tetragrammaton. This was all set up by Charlash, who was getting revenge for Lonrot having put his brother away and put a few slugs of lead into him earlier. And knowing that Lonrot is always outsmarting himself and always over-intellectualizing, created this kind of trap for him to fall into, this labyrinth, if you will, for him to fall into. And a bit, probably the most cryptic aspect of this is that at the end, Charlash revolver right at Lonrot. He's gonna off him, just blows him away, and says that he promises Lonrot a simpler labyrinth in the next time that he kills him. Then he blows him away. So that's that is the Death in the Compass. The approach to Al-Mutazim is... Oh, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, and Lonrot even tells him, okay, the next time we do this, make it go like this.
Make it a Zeno's arrow instead of a Tetragrammaton.
Exactly. So the idea is that this is an eternal thing between the two of them, and they will keep playing this game again and again and again and again forever. Variations and permutations.
Right, exactly. It's hence a genre fiction, right? The detective, the what we might call the Platonic ideal of the detective is always being menaced by the Platonic ideal of his Moriarty, and around and around again and again. The next one, approach to Al-Mutazim, and Claude, I apologize in advance. This was actually one of the ones that I read earliest when we were preparing for this, and so it might be the least together in my head for letting everybody know about it here. And it's also just one of the most delightfully shifty stories I've ever read, because it takes the form of a book review of the second edition of a fictitious book. It is written in the voice of a reviewer reviewing a book that he very much admired the first edition, but finds the second edition that gets all the credit and is getting spread throughout the world in translation. The second edition is vastly inferior to this first edition. But this is a book called The Approach to Al-Mutazim, written by Mir Bahadur Ali, who is an Indian professional, lawyer, and so this is this novel that he has written. But the actual plot of the novel, well, Borges first of all complains about how it's much more facile in the second edition, that it's much more cryptic and mysterious in its first edition, and its second edition is just a little too packed, a little too. A law student in India, in Bombay. He comes from a Muslim family, but is himself secular. He does not feel any real connection with the Muslim faith, but he gets caught up in, which were sadly very common during the era where Borges was writing these stories, as the kind of the decolonial movement in India was picking up steam. He gets caught up in a sectarian riot and impulsively kills a Hindu person. And from there, he flees to a Tower of Silence, which is a particular burial practice of the Parsi minority, which is minority in India, who are Zoroastrian. So they leave their dead out to be scavenged rather than burying them. They let them be scavenged so that when their bones are deposited in the earth, it doesn't pollute the earth. But there is a robber who is there just yanking gold teeth out of the poor chap scavenged. This law student begins a journey across India. Just kind of, he himself is sort of cast into the lowest of the low by his crime and by his contact with these horrible people. So he's interacting with the untouchables, right, the destitute, and he infers the existence of a perfect man that he calls al-mutasim, which in Arabic is he who goes in search of aid. And the Muslim conceives of this perfect man as this higher spiritual being, a kind of having attained this kind of spiritual clarity, and so he goes on this vast pilgrimage to try to find him, and he eventually hears the law student enters into that house, and the book ends at that point. The reviewer in the story, lists a lot of criticisms of this. He finds that whole thing much too packed compared to its first edition, and he ends by summarizing an old Muslim fable, the Conference of the Birds, by which there's a conclave of birds that come together to basically combine their essences into a single great bird, the Simurg. And that's the that's the approach to al-Mutasim. To unpack, for sure.
So
but yes, I'll kick it back to you, Claude, as we connect this to everything else we're talking about.
Yeah. All right. So we wanted to take on, these are two of Borges, I think, more well-known stories. If you know Borges, you probably know these, and these are his sort of like games with smoke and mirrors, basically. So Death in the Compass, the more you put an emphasis on it, the more you really sort of see that the criminal and the detective are kind of one and the same. Now, this is kind of like a concept that goes back to Oedipus, and this is sort of like the 20th century insight into Oedipus. Oedipus is the detective and the murderer. That he's sort of the original detective, because if you read Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, Oedipus is trying to figure out the murder, right? And who is the murderer himself? It all leads back into a circle. You can't sort of get out of the labyrinth of fate. Lönnrot and the dandy Red Sherlock both have red in their names. They're reflections of each other. Roth, the German for red, Red Sherlock, he's a redhead. So there's this way in which they're both reflections of each other. And the reason people are killed is because the detective is trying to find out the murder. Right. So it's sort of like there wouldn't be any murders if the detective wasn't trying to figure out the murders. And ultimately, he is the final victim. All right. Approach to al-Mutasim is playing some very, very weird similar games. He gives you options because you've got one version of the story, and then you've got another version of the story. In one version of the story, when the law student, the putative main character, goes through the door, he encounters one thing. In another version, he encounters nothing, is going back the other way. The way it sort of functions is that there's this mystery gap, right? There's this hole in meaning where everything should make sense, and you're left shuttling backwards and forwards between these two different versions, or between two different readings, or between meaning and nothingness. Either everything means everything, and he goes through the door and becomes the enlightened one, or everything means nothing. He goes through the door and finds only frustration and has to repeat the quest going backwards. Both are reasonable options within the scope of the text, because apparently within the text, both are good reads, and there is no definitive edition. And even the author of The Approach to Al-Mutazim is this mysterious, weird character. However, this is Borges playing another weird game with smoke and mirrors. Who is the actual author of The Approach to Al-Mutazim? Jorge Luis Borges, right. Because the story is called The Approach to Al-Mutazim, so the mysterious lost author, the mysterious lost creator of all, is the author himself. It's all a reflection back on the author. There's no way to escape authorship. There's no way to escape this sort of like trap that he built for the characters. But that leads us into thinking about genre as a form of escapism itself. All right, if genre is going to operate, it needs to have clear parameters. You need a detective, you need an archvillain. You need a crime, you need this. You need these clues, you need this, that, and the other. The way genre functions is through a very set, specific, bunch of parameters, right? If those parameters are deviated from to such a degree, then the genre is not the genre anymore. So the way that genre operates as escapism is by being the same thing over and over again, a sort of thing that you can't escape, right? There can be moves to step outside it, to give a variation or a permutation, but ultimately it's all the same. W.H. Auden loved detective stories, and he loved genre fiction. And he said, a good mystery is like a drug. You read it, you don't remember it 2 days later, and yet you need another one almost exactly like it to continue the high next week. So it's sort of like it keeps going. There's this way in which escapist fiction has to have certain very strict parameters. Otherwise, it can't be escapist anymore. So there's this way in which Borges is playing with the genre of detective fiction to sort of put this trap around detective fiction, to sort of utilize the fact that it has to have these things. Otherwise, it doesn't work. These are variations of detective fiction, but they're just variations that allow us to see the same thing again, right? Make sense? Okay. So the second kind of escapism,
absolutely,
kind of
I'm absolutely on board,
that we were thinking of is, the second form of escape that we were looking at is the escape narrative, the narrative that is that sort of emerges from mostly American experiences, I suppose, of someone. Yeah, we lost Daniel. Of someone being kidnapped by Native Americans and then raised by that group, somehow coming back or managing to escape from that group. And if you look at the literature, it's often really fraught, right? It's sort of like, all right, go to the John Ford film, The Searchers, where when, John Wayne finally finds the girl he's been looking for, she doesn't want to come back. She's quote unquote gone native. All right. So escape narratives hinge on this idea of somebody sort of being taken and either being forced back or rescued back in some way, shape, or form. So Borges wrote a couple of these, and the two in particular that we're looking at are the captive. They're very brief, but they're the captive and the story of the warrior and the captive maiden. So, Daniel, can you tell us really quickly? Back at the right time. Can you tell us really quickly what this one-page story of the captive is about? Yeah, no, I was gonna say, like, you were going in and out there. I was just gonna conclude really quick. They see each other, and then she does this weird demonstration. Oh, that's okay. She does this weird demonstration of drinking hot blood straight from a deer's neck. All right. So the thing about this the thing about this this story and these two stories in a lot of, I guess, literature of the Americas, and I believe specifically in Latin American literature, there's a very strict differentiation between the civilized and the barbaric. There's a sort of quintessential text which I've heard about but not read, so don't quote me on this, but Facundo, which sort of lays out this kind of philosophical differentiation between the quote unquote barbarian and the quote unquote civilized European. A more familiar text that plays with this might be Love in the Time of Cholera, which is trying to think through this integration of high cultural values represented in the European and some kind of native intensity or something like that that Garcia Marquez is working through. Well, Borges is really curious in this way that he really looks at the way these terms dismantle each other. What is the barbarian? What is the civilized? What is the one thing? What is the other? And he gives us these two categories, gives us examples from these two categories. And the more you look at it, the more they blend and merge, and they don't really operate as clear categories anymore. Which is what? What is which? How does this really? How do we differentiate these things? And at the end of the day, they're reflections of each other. They're not clear cut differentiations. They reflect each other more than I think either binary would be comfortable with. So that's another sort of version of escape that we were looking at in Borges. And the final one, and I guess this is a little bit of a stretch, but the final one has to do with erudition. Borges was an extraordinarily erudite author, and he may not have had all of the sort of educational credentials that others did, but he certainly made up for it with his vast accumulation of knowledge. With that in mind, we took a look at the Aleph, and the Aleph is this story where this narrator begins by a narrator who claims to be Borges begins by talking about this woman who he had loved, who clearly didn't love him back. He knew that because he would give her books every year. And one year he just stopped looking to see whether or not the pages were cut. They never were. But she dies. And on the anniversary of her death, every year he goes to have lunch or dinner with her family, uh, one of them being her cousin, who is this bizarre poet who is trying to write the poem of the world. The way that the narrator describes it, this cousin is writing, pages and pages and pages and pages, and his commentary on his own poem is much more interesting and insightful than the poems. At the end of the day, the guy says, the poet tells this Borges narrator that the reason he's able to write this poem of the world and describe all of these things in Australia that he's never seen is because in the basement of his house is an Aleph. And the problem is that there's a construction company that wants to buy the house to tear it down and turn it into a cafe, and they can't do that because they're going to destroy the Aleph. An Aleph, he claims, is a point in space and a point in space that shows all time happening simultaneously. So he invites the Borges narrator to come look into the Aleph, and he lays down on a dingy mattress in the bottom of the basement and stares up at the sky until he sees a point in space that says all time at once. It shows him all time at once. What it shows him, essentially, is the woman he loved having a passionate love affair with this mediocre poet who he despises. At the end of it, he tells the poet, "You're crazy, you're delusional, sell the house, get them to tear it down. And there's 2 pages of erudition, basically an argument about why this cannot be the true Aleph. And he gives example after example after example in literature of what a real Aleph would be. This Borges narrator is using his erudition and his intellect to try to get out from under the truth that he really can't escape. This woman never really loved him. It's an extraordinary moment. Yeah, exactly. And so I think we're out of time, Luke. Yeah, we gotta go, but thank you for listening to us. Sure, I'm gonna hang out there, and I'll see you guys over there. Sorry for going long, sort of vamping for time. I Alright, cool, and we'll get out of the way of the next meeting.